Wonderful. Welcome. Hello. Thank you for joining us tonight for the sixth and final session in our Own Your Sound Mastering the Business of Music webinar series. Yay! I know some folks have been with us for all six. Some of us, this maybe is your first one joining us, or you've been popping in and out. We really designed it that way and have been recording all of these webinars to sort of fit where you are on your music journey. So we're excited for tonight's content. I'm Meredith Badler. I'm the Deputy Director at the CBCA, the Colorado Business Committee for the Arts. And we are delighted to co-present this series with our friends at the Colorado Music Industry Alliance. And we'll share a little bit more about those two organizations in a moment. Just a few Zoom housekeeping items. We are recording tonight's webinar, so it is live for those joining us this evening on April 7th. If you are watching this later on YouTube or someone shared the recording with you, hello. We're so glad you found your way to this content. And all of these webinars, all six, have been recorded and posted on YouTube. They're all available in a playlist that we'll put in the chat in a moment. Because we are recording, we ask that you stay on mute and keep your camera off. That just helps us all stay focused, avoid any background distractions. But we still want to hear from you. Introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're coming from. That's also the best way to ask questions. There will be certainly time for Q&A at the end. Excuse me. And as always, we just ask you to be respectful, show up with your best self, show up ready to learn and support our shared learning. We're all here to gain something from tonight's session. There are no more remaining webinars. You cannot sign up for any more, but you can certainly go on and watch and share all of the great content that has been put out there throughout this series. So this, as I mentioned, is the final of 6 weeks. We've been doing this every Monday night since the beginning of March, hosted by our two organizations. So CBCA, the Colorado Business Committee for the Arts. We do a lot of things to connect arts and business across Colorado. One of those is Colorado Attorneys for the Arts. So we run a legal referral service to connect artists of all kinds, musicians, filmmakers, writers, painters, with legal assistance, usually on a pro bono basis, as well as legal education, like you are participating in this evening. And we're joined by our friends at the Colorado Music Industry Alliance, CMIA. DNA, do you want to say hello? I know he might have his hands full at the moment. I can give a quick shout out for CMIA. They are a recently formed organization here in Colorado, really intended to be sort of the one-stop shop, that centralized hub for all these different elements of our amazing and diverse music industry here in Colorado. They have some great events coming up. Check out their website and social media to get lots of resources. They've already become such a great aggregator of resources for our music industry. So we are very delighted to partner with CMIA for this series and hopefully many more things in the future. But you are not here to hear from myself. Our final session tonight is really talking about sort of the business aspects of running your band or running your music endeavor. So what does that mean to have an LLC or an agreement between your band, trademark? Really, your band is a small business. So that's what we'll be talking about this evening. And we are bringing back Dave Ratner with the Creative Law Network. We've been switching back and forth with our speakers, and Dave gets to be our capstone speaker for this series. So Dave, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can get into what you have for us tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I assume Hopefully we can all see that slide or this first slide. And appreciate the introduction, Meredith, and appreciate everybody being here. Like Meredith said, I know we have a lot of folks who have been here a lot. We've had a lot of great content here over the past 6 weeks. So thank you all for being here. For those of you who have not been here for all of them, as Meredith said, they are available online. And also will encourage everybody to introduce themselves in the chat. Feel free to put comments in the chat. I will try and keep up as that happens. And we will get through as much as we can. These are not these topics tonight are a little different because we spend a lot of time talking about copyrights and contracts and all the deals that we do in the music industry. And this is kind of the background, right? This is the stuff that the foundation of a lot of the business of music. And we're talking, I mean, the title of this series is to master the business of music. So this stuff is still important. Tell your friends they weren't here tonight. Come check it out later because there's a lot of stuff about running your music business that is important. Brief introduction. My name is Dave Ratner. If I haven't met you, I know there's a lot of friends here tonight, but if I haven't met you, I am an attorney. I run a law firm called Creative Law Network. We specialize in working with creative people and businesses. Personally, I am a recovering band manager, so I know a lot about band agreements from before I even became a lawyer. I was a band manager. Before that, I was a tour manager. Before that, I was on the road just selling merch and hauling gear. And so I've done a lot on the other side of the industry prior to becoming a lawyer that has taught me a lot about lawyering in the music industry. So a lot of this stuff is stuff I wish that I knew back then, that I didn't know back then. I think I learned a lot more about the music side, the stuff we've talked about over the past 5 weeks, than I did about the business side. So this business side is nonetheless very important. As you probably know at this point, we're talking about running your band like a business, talking about LLCs and corporations. We're going to talk about band agreements and trademarks. The first two of those are more related than the last one. So we'll definitely, obviously we'll try and leave time for everything, but those first two, there's a lot of crossover between the entity, the LLC or corporation, and the band agreement, or at least that's the way I present it anyway. So we will talk about treating your band or your music activities as a business. We will talk about entities, which are LLCs, corporations, partnerships. We will talk about band agreements and really the key terms that go into a band agreement, as well as trademarks and how they work, why they matter. And a lot of this stuff, I think you will find useful in other areas of your life, especially if there are other hustles in your life. I know someone here posted doing digital marketing during the daytime, so to speak. This stuff definitely applies a lot to digital marketing. And actually, as performing musicians, a lot of us have to do digital marketing just to promote our shows or our events or our music. So there is a lot of crossover here between probably some other things going on in your life that might not be directly to your music industry activities. So talking about a band as a business, this does apply to almost everybody, not just bands. Certainly, most of tonight will be in the context of a band, but if you say, well, I'm a producer, I'm not in a band, this still matters. This still applies to you. And again, tell your friends who didn't show up tonight that this applies to them as well, even if they're not in a band, because your occupation is your business. Like if you are a producer, you're getting paid to do your work. You're running a business. And this applies. And it's also really helpful to treat your music industry exploits, the things you do in the industry, as a business. Keeping clean books and records, documenting your work, having contracts with people, having the proper bank accounts, and things that I will talk about. But again, it applies whether or not you're a business. It's kind of the band as a business has some nice alliteration to it, or is that onomatopoeia? Anyway, band as a business sounds good, but there's a lot of music as a business that is really what we're talking about today. So I've often talked about how, or I frequently do talk about how it is not contradictory to treat art as a business. I think a lot of us in our artistic endeavors want to think of it as somehow separate from the hustle and bustle or the grind or the chasing the dollar side of a business. And it doesn't have to be a business isn't a negative term when it comes to art. think that's something we just, as an overall thought process, is helpful to keep in mind or to use, is that treating it like a business is actually more respect for your art, because using this analogy really works to advance your art and your business, or advance your art through business. So the band analogy, or for any performing artist, is really apt. It's that the music that you are creating, whether it's performing it live or selling it, online or in physical product, that's a product, right? It's something we're trying to sell. We're trying to distribute out to the world, and our fans or our followers are our customers. And so we use live performances. It's providing a service. It's doing marketing for the recorded music, and promoting your music is really promoting your business. So this band as a business, or this music business analogy, really is apt, and I think hopefully will weave its way through tonight's presentation. Tonight is also meant to bring it all together, the past 5 weeks. Bring it all together, meaning we talked about a lot of things that will be covered by the stuff we're doing tonight. Even if I'm not specifically talking out a record deal or something like that, it still matters, because that record deal is going to be related to the business that we're talking about. And also to this kind of business structure where we're talking about the copyrights that we've been talking about week after week are assets, right? They're intellectual property. They're assets that we're going to use to make money, ideally. And distributing those assets is part of running our business. These different, the past 2 weeks that I've been here, or weeks 2 and 4 that I was here, I talked a lot about the different revenue streams from these different assets. Well, those revenue streams are our music business revenue, right? And we talked a lot about contracts in the past few weeks. These contracts are contracts with other people in the music business. It's about memorializing those deals that we do in the business. So that is a setup for why we're having this discussion tonight. Hopefully puts it in context for us. So thinking about the structure, okay, I'm talking about business entities. And a business entity is just a type of company or corporation. There's different types of entities that I've listed a few here. An LLC, which is a limited liability company. A corporation is another type of entity. A partnership is another type of entity. So when I say entity, it refers to any of those structures. And the main thing that runs through all these is to keep the idea that an entity is a separate person under the law, that an entity can sign contracts, if it has a bank, it can have a bank account, it can do these things, and we want to keep the individual and the entity separate. And one of the main reasons that we do this from the lawyer's perspective, I'm not a tax accountant or a tax lawyer, so I won't, I will talk about taxes tonight, but not in any way that is tax advice, that's for sure. But from a lawyer's perspective, a lot of the value for forming an entity in any line of work, in any industry, is this liability protection, this liability shield between the individual and the entity. Because since this entity can run its own business, can sign contracts, can have a bank account, we can keep that separate from the individual, and then the individual isn't liable for what the business does. Now, I will probably talk a number of different ways tonight about liability and things that can go wrong. I'm not anticipating or expecting anybody in this presentation to ever have to be in a lawsuit or get in trouble or anything like that. But in the lawyer's world, that's what happens. So we think that way. We think in worst case scenarios. And I think about it as these are ways that I can protect my clients, is by using these tools to protect the individual from liability for what the entity does. And you may say, well, I'm a recording musician, I'm a performing musician. What liability could I have? Well, yes, I know you're not likely to take guitar and smash someone on the head with it. But if someone is at one of your performances and slips and falls, or a lighting rig hits somebody, or all sorts of, again, worst case scenarios can happen. What we don't want to happen is for you as an individual to be liable, to get sued for that negative thing that happens. So one of the values of having an entity is that the entity is responsible for what you're doing in your music business, not you as an individual being responsible for what happens in your music business. I should, by the way, preface that everything I say tonight is not legal advice. Nothing I say tonight is legal advice. While I certainly give legal advice to my clients, we don't have an attorney-client relationship here with all you wonderful people listening in, so none of this is legal advice. I have to conclude that disclaimer. So we'll talk about entity formation because to start a company, an LLC, a corporation, we form that company with the state of Colorado. Most of us are in Colorado here, so that's an easy example. But we start by filing a document with the Secretary of State of Colorado, or whatever state you're in, or whatever state you form your entity in. And one of the common misconceptions about forming an entity is a lot of people think, oh, well, I filed that document with the Secretary of State and now I have an entity. In Colorado, if you want to form an LLC, you file articles of organization. It's the name of the form that we file. And you give the state Secretary of State some basic information. You have filed to form an LLC in the state of Colorado. However, that is not a fully formed entity. That, for liability protection purposes and a number of the other things we'll talk about tonight, there's more that goes into establishing the entity and ensuring that liability shield. Simple example is that, well, if we had one of these unfortunate incidents where somebody gets hurt or something gets damaged and there is a lawsuit, we don't want, as we said, we don't want that damaged person to sue you as an individual. And if they do sue you as an individual, you need to be able to say, no, it's my entity that is responsible. You should be suing my entity, not me as an individual. Well, to prove that there's a difference between the individual and the entity, we need more than just a piece of paper with the Secretary of State. We need more than just a single document. And that's some of the things I'll be talking about tonight is having additional documentation, having clean books and records, having a separate bank account. These are all things that distinguish the entity from the individual and maintain that liability shield between the two. So, as I said a moment ago, separate finances are crucial. One of the things we generally do when we set up an entity is we get an EIN, which actually stands for Employer Identification Number. You don't have to have employees to get an EIN. It's really the tax identification number for an entity. That's what an EIN is. And having that EIN for this entity that we have formed allows us to get a separate bank account for that entity, which is an important thing to do to keep the two separate. It's also helpful in a band arrangement because then we have one bank account for the whole band and we're not using individuals' bank accounts also, so that a lot of times if a band has set up a bank, or if a band is using one member's bank account and one member's social security number, that one member is liable for all the taxes for the whole band. And that's not usually how we want it to happen. So the EIN is like a social security number for the entity, where you fill out a W-9 when someone pays you as an independent contractor. We can put the EIN on that W-9. And so it also allows us, or rather, another important step from the financial side of forming an entity is to have separate books and records that goes along with having a bank account. I know most of us don't have checkbooks for our bank account, but the point is you're keeping the money separate. The money for the entity is kept separate from the money for the individual. I kind of say that you're not going to take the company credit card and go buy your groceries, right? We're going to keep those things separate. Ideally, we're not going to do that anyway. And that's an important part of, again, enjoying that liability protection that entity provides. There are different tax implications depending on how we structure the entity. I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. So I think it's helpful to, the main entities that we would consider dealing with are an LLC or a corporation. Most of us in the music industry, for most of the things we're doing, we're going to be using an LLC. It is a much more flexible entity, less structure around it, less laws, generally in most states, less laws governing LLCs. And it's just a lighter entity, an easier entity to employ. There are reasons to use corporations, and in the interest of time, and also the folks I think that are here, I think we're going to focus on LLCs tonight. I'll talk briefly about the two and the differences, just to understand why entities are different or how these entities are different. So an LLC it's a company, right? It's a limited liability company. The owners of the company are called members. So if we have 4 members of the band, the 4 members own the LLC. They're also the 4 members of the LLC. But LLC is generally run by managers for the most part, because the managers get to make the day-to-day business decisions for the company. And that may be, agreeing to gigs or signing a contract, writing a check, things like that. Also importantly, an LLC is what we call a disregarded entity for tax purposes. That means is the LLC as an entity isn't taxed. The LLC doesn't have to file a bank account or pay taxes to the IRS or the state, generally. In contrast, a corporation is owned by stockholders or shareholders. They own shares in a corporation. That's probably a common concept to most of us. And generally is run by a board of directors. So people who are in charge of making those business decisions for the corporation. And generally, a corporation is taxed separately. So the individual shareholders are taxed, and then the corporation can also be taxed. So that is one of the reasons we don't often use corporations. I will talk briefly about tax implications because they are important, but as you will see, please consult with a tax professional when you're making these considerations because everybody's situation is different. Your status as an individual, as an owner of a company, will affect the tax implications for you as with that company. But very basically, as I said, an LLC is a disregarded entity, which means the taxes pass through the entity to the individual members. By example, if you have 4 members of an LLC, that LLC makes, let's say, $100,000 in profit, which would be a great thing in a year. And those 4 members each own 25% of the LLC. The 4 members are each liable for $25,000 or tax on those $25,000. So the tax passes through the entity to the members. By default, a single member LLC is what we call a sole proprietorship. And this is confusing, by the way. It'll be very confusing. It comes up a lot if you're filling out a W-9, which is the IRS form we use when people are paying us as an independent contractor. It can be very confusing because a single member LLC will check the box for sole proprietor. They actually updated the form this year, so I don't remember exactly how it's structured now. But point is that the IRS basically doesn't know what an LLC is in the sense that if it is a single member LLC, it is taxed as a sole proprietor, which means if I'm just a person doing business as in my own name, I'm a sole proprietor. If I've never formed an entity, I'm a sole proprietor. So the tax implications are the same. By default, if there are multiple members of an LLC, it's taxed as a partnership, which again is what I was talking about, the revenue being, or the profits being distributed, tax liability for the profits being distributed to the individual members. An LLC does not file a separate tax return, but if there are multiple members of an LLC, there's a form called a K-1 that basically tells the IRS who the members are, what percentage of the LLC they own. So just basic tax treatment for an LLC. Like I said, not tax advice. Similarly, some basic tax treatment information for a corporation. Gets even a little bit more complicated. There are 2 different main ways a corporation will be taxed. We call an S corp or a C corp. That's because it's the chapter in the tax code, chapter S versus chapter C. A C corp is double tax, which we never want to have to deal with. Basically, what that means is the individuals are taxed on the money they make from the C corp, and the C corp is taxed as well. That's why we call it double tax. Very rare. I don't think most people on this call will not be involved in a C corp and related to your music business for the most part. Not very common. There is a function, or rather an option called an S corp that you can elect for that allows for single tax, but it also has restrictions on who can be owners, how many owners you can have. And even if it is an S corp, it still have to file a separate tax return. So again, probably not something most of you will run into. Please do consult a tax professional if you are considering a corporation or any of these business options as far as what your tax liability might be. So that is my tax spiel. I want to talk much more about how this actually works in real life, okay? And I'm going to focus on LLCs because it is the most common entity structure that we use in the music industry, whether it's for a band or for a touring entity. Honestly, even if you're more on the promoter side or on the marketing side, I mean, a lot of us will form an LLC as our business entity in Colorado anyway, based on the laws that we have here. So as I said earlier, an LLC is owned by members. So the owners, instead of being shareholders, we are members of an LLC. Members own membership interests, which is instead of shares or stock, membership interests, but it's the same idea. It's a percentage of the company. And the management structure can vary. And this is something that we have management in LLCs. We have management by managers, but an LLC manager is not the same as a band or artist manager or a business manager. It's similar term, completely different purpose for the most part anyway. Most times, if we have a band and the band has an artist manager, that person is not the manager of the LLC, because the manager or managers of the LLC get to make the day-to-day business decisions for the entity. Like I said earlier, writing checks or making payments, signing contracts, just making decisions of these day-to-day business decisions. The members get to vote on the major business decisions. So things like if we need to shut down the company or we're adding more people to the company, things like that are the major business decisions that we leave to a vote of the members. Managers have and when we have a member vote, we want to memorialize that vote with like meeting minutes and resolutions. It's a much more formal process than just making day-to-day business decisions that managers can make without that whole formality. So a lot of businesses, I mean, for the most part, every LLC that I form for a client, I file and set up as a manager managed LLC, because it's easier, smoother, quicker to run that management structure. Managers can be paid for their services as a manager. That is allowed. Every band or every LLC gets to decide on whether that's something we want to do, but it is a way that managers get paid. The members receive distributions of profits. So what I mean by that is, on maybe an annual basis or whatever, the LLC can decide, hey, we're going to distribute profits, and those distributions are paid to the members based on their membership interests. So if there's 4 LLC members, they each have 25%. The company makes $100,000 in profits this year, should be great. The company can decide, hey, let's distribute those profits. Each member will get $25,000. Now, an LLC doesn't have to distribute those profits. It can hold on to those profits because it needs to buy a new van or pay to record an album or whatever else it might want to invest in. But one of the things that's often confusing is people think, oh, I'm a member of the LLC, so I'm going to get a percentage of every dollar the LLC makes. And it doesn't have to work that way. It generally doesn't work that way, because the LLC generally needs to have money to run, right? Like I said, to put gas in the van, so to speak. So it doesn't automatically mean that just because you're an owner of an LLC, all the money that comes to that LLC goes to you as a member. It can. And one of the things that we'll be talking about is, how do we structure that? How do we decide how those payments are made? That's an important part of it as well. So another important part of an LLC that comes up frequently, and one of the reasons we're like, wow, we really need some structure here, we need to know how things are going to happen, how things will be handled, is because membership interests can be transferred, right? People buy and sell stock in public corporations. Well, this is not a big public corporation, but it's still a piece of a company. And pieces of companies can be bought and sold, but in an LLC situation, we generally have restrictions on the transfer of the interest, because we can't, if you use the example of a band, as I will continue to do, one band member can't just go sell their interest to some stranger, and that stranger is now owner of the band. That wouldn't work right. So we generally have restrictions on transfer that limit what we can do with our membership interests, because those membership interests are property. It's an asset. And like I said, just like if you own stock, it's something that has value. And therefore, we want to make sure we're controlling for how that asset can be transacted. It is not easy to assign the value, the dollar amount of membership interest, especially in most of the music businesses we're talking about today, because it's hard to figure out what the assets of a music LLC can't usually easily be sold on the open market for a set price. Different than if you're a car dealership and you have a lot full of cars, you know what those cars are worth, and therefore it's a lot easier to assign value. So they're thinking about, what is this interest in this LLC worth is an important exercise, we also unfortunately have to consider what happens if one of the LLC members passes away. Again, I'm your worst case scenario guy, so I have to think about these things. And we generally don't want those membership interests to just transfer to a deceased member's heirs, because those heirs are not involved in the business and don't necessarily know everything that's going on with the business. So we have to deal with all these things, right? We have to cover answers to all these questions. How do all these things happen? And generally the way we do that is with an operating agreement. So an operating agreement, like it sounds like, is a document, a contract about how the LLC operates. It's a contract between the LLC and the individual members of the LLC. And it talks about how we do all these things, right? The governing document for this LLC. So talking about who are the members, what percentage of membership interests, do they own? Who are the managers? What are the managers' obligations? What powers they have? How do they make decisions? When are profits distributed? How do we decide when profits are distributed? How membership interests are transferred? All these things that I've been talking about for the past 2 minutes go into an operating agreement for an LLC. And it just so happens that the stuff that goes into an operating agreement is also very similar to the stuff that goes into a band agreement. So the way that I structure this conversation is talk about the operating agreement in the context of a band agreement and vice versa. Because if we treat a band as a business, okay, if we're treating our music enterprises as a business, thinking about in the context of, okay, we formed an LLC for this purpose. And in this situation with a band analogy, right, we formed this band. This band is functioning as a business. We're going to form an LLC for this band. And then we're going to have an operating agreement for this band. Well, this band also needs a band agreement. So instead of having a band agreement and operating agreement, let's just combine them into one document. This is not required. This is just one way of doing things. Certainly, a band can have a band agreement without an LLC. An LLC can have an operating agreement that is not a band agreement. But I mean, for the interest of trying to get us all out of here, in time for dinner, we're gonna treat it as have this conversation in terms of band agreements and operating agreements being the same document for this purpose. So basically, as I have kind of alluded to, we want to make sure our agreement covers the unexpected as well as the basic terms that I've been talking about. And whether it's an operating agreement or not, the reason we have a band agreement is we need to write down the way things work. I've had countless conversations with bands that say, we're all bros, we know the deal, right? We all know how this works. We don't have to write it down. It's on a handshake. And I get that. And I value handshakes. But as a lawyer, I've learned how hard it is to enforce handshakes or oral agreements, right? Because if we have an oral agreement and there is a dispute, I guarantee you the dispute is we're not going to align on what we agreed upon, right? If the dispute is, well, what percentage of this song we own, or what percentage of this company we own, or who gets to make decisions in this company, well, one side's going to think one thing, the other side thinks the other. That's why we have a dispute, right? So if we have an agreement, we have a written agreement, we're much better off. As with all contracts, in an ideal world, I'd love for you to hire a lawyer to do it, right? That's why we have Colorado Attorneys for the Arts, so that if you can't afford a lawyer, you can get a lawyer through CAFTA. I also understand not everybody's going to get a lawyer for every contract they touch, and that's okay, but you don't need to make it more complicated than necessary. So if you are going to go the way of writing your own band agreement, you don't need to use a whole bunch of legalese and legal mumbo jumbo, right? You just have to lay out what are the terms, what are the deal points that we've agreed to? How do we run this band? How do we run this business? How do we make decisions? How do we pay ourselves or get paid? What do we do with the money? What happens if somebody leaves? All those sorts of things go into this band agreement. And that's the idea of considering and trying to cover the various things that can happen in the future. So start with the basics, and then we'll expand this to cover as many different scenarios as you can think of. Play the lawyer, think of the worst case scenarios. If Joe owns the van and we crash the van, does the band pay to replace the van? I can come up with these things all day, right? There's all sorts of worst case scenarios. So Hopefully none of them happen to any of you, but this is what lawyers do. So we're going to talk about these key terms in a band agreement. And so just you have an idea of what's coming. If you want to ask a question, you are always welcome to pop it into the chat. But certainly know these are the things we are going to talk about. We'll talk about band ownership, management of the LLC, not of the band. No, we're not talking about the management agreement. We did that already the prior week. But also things about ownership and use of the band name, rights to the publishing, what we call the composition, rights to the masters, band funds, right? What do we do with the money? Where does it go and who gets to control it? Merchandising rights are important for most bands, and very important and hard to deal with leaving members and new members for a band. So for those of you that are not in a band, you can think of this in terms of your business if you have other partners in your business. But this is, again, thinking about all the issues that come up for bands and what we want to have in our band agreement / operating agreement to cover ourselves and address all the issues. So first thing, as I mentioned, ownership and management. Who are the owners of this LLC, or who are the owners of this band? Not all band members are always owners. As I'm sure you can figure out, there's a lot of different scenarios we can have with ownership of a band, and plenty of historical examples of things that have unfortunately gone to court about who owned a band. But it's okay. Not everybody has to be an owner. We sometimes have a situation where there's a primary songwriter and a bunch of hired guns, so to speak. Or there's the original members that are the owner and the new members are not owners or not owners yet. All sorts of different ways this can work, which is one of the reasons it's a challenge to kind of find a one size fits all. That's why we really want to know the specific terms for your specific situation, then memorialize those terms in this agreement. So once we identify who are the owners, let's talk about how are decisions made, right? So how are we choosing what gigs to play or what manager to hire or how much to pay or all those sorts of things. And again, in an LLC structure, it's generally the LLC managers generally get to make those decisions. Any of the members can be a manager. You could have a manager who's not a member. That happens sometimes. We hire a manager for the LLC. But for the most part, most of the situations we're generally dealing with are the band members. The band members are also the LLC members. The LLC members are also the managers. And some people say, well, why do I have to be a member and a manager? And again, it's just for the decision-making function. It's just that managers get to make these day-to-day business decisions without a lot of formality. That also can be divided up any which way. You could say there's 4 managers and everything is a majority vote. Or you could say this manager gets to decide touring questions, what gigs we play and for how much. This manager gets to handle our manager. This manager gets to deal with our finances. There's a lot of different ways we can do this. One of the reasons I said that LLCs are great is because they're super flexible. These are all the ways that an LLC can be flexible. It also can be, that does present challenges for sure, but it ultimately is a good thing because it allows us to use this valuable business structure to work in a lot of different ways. So another thing that we want to make sure to have in this agreement is how we make decisions, right? The voting structure and the voting threshold. So the major business decisions are made by a vote of the members. And you can say it's a majority vote. You could say it requires 60%, 70%, what we call a supermajority. Generally, I don't recommend we make unanimous or require unanimous vote. And again, not providing legal advice, but when we require unanimous vote, it allows one person to hold up all the works, right? One person who maybe is just pissed about last night can say, I'm not voting for that. And that can make it difficult. So unanimous, we really reserve for very specific scenarios. But point is, we can structure this any way we want. We just have to write it down, decide on it, write it down in an agreement. How are these major decisions made? And then how are the management decisions made, the day-to-day business decisions? Are those made by a majority, or do individual managers, individual members have, well, individual members acting as managers have certain powers? One person gets to run the finances, that sort of thing. So that's a lot. And I'm obviously all night tonight, we're fitting a lot into one slide, so to speak. But these are all things that it may be intuitive, like, oh, I'm in a band, I know how this works. We've been doing this for years. Writing it down is really valuable. And if we're in a new band, even more important to write it down so we know what the deal is and don't have disagreements down the road. So another key term for this band agreement is about the band name. And very basically, who owns the band name? A lot of times, the LLC can own the band name. The entity owns it because the entity owns the band name and all the members own the entity. So that's an easy way to have control over a lot of assets, but in this situation, the band name. And it can be an individual. Sometimes an individual came up with the name. Plenty of times, an individual started playing under that name and then added band members. That's fine. Let's just lay it out. Let's just be clear about how this works. And that goes in this band agreement or this operating agreement. We also want to talk about any restrictions on the use of the name. Restrictions are generally something that's going to happen when things change, right? Like, can this name only be used if these same 4 people are in the band? Or if we lose one of those people, can we still use that name? Because sometimes the name really does only represent this group and we really want to keep it that way. Other times it really represents 1 or 2 or 3 of the people. And as long as those people are still around, we can use the name. But also what happens if the band dissolves? If it's just not going to keep going anymore. Every band, runs its course. And what happens to the name at that point? Because usually 1 or more people are going to want to keep using it. And we want to be prepared for those scenarios. So thinking ahead about that and talking about ownership of this name, and a name is a trademark, we'll talk about that a little bit later, is something we want to make sure we're thinking about ahead of time and writing down in this agreement. Similarly, if we're a type of band where people have side projects, can they use it for that purpose? All these different possibilities are all things we want to address in this agreement. So thinking about the band name is going to be a really important one. Next thing we want to talk about in our band agreement is the publishing rights, or what we call the composition. You'll remember from past weeks, this is a song that is written down that a songwriter creates is what we call the publishing. And that is separate from the sound recording or the master, right? The publishing copyright, the composition copyright is separate from the sound recording copyright. Copyrights are intellectual property, right? They are assets. So who owns these assets? Generally, most situations, the individual songwriters retain their publishing. Usually, publishing rights aren't granted to the band or to the LLC. However, even in that situation, who administers, who controls the revenue collection and, as you say, exploitation or use of those publishing rights? So in a situation where all 4 members of the band are writing a song together, or even just a couple of the members are writing a song together, who gets to control how that song is used, how those publishing rights are used? And it may be as simple as the individual songwriters keep their publishing rights, they get to decide. That's fine, but let's just write it down, right? Just make it easier so we know for the future how all this works. Sometimes we let the band entity, this LLC, act as the publishing company or the administrator, because as we talked about, I think it was week 2, we talked about publishing rights. We talked about how there's a business in administering publishing, going out and collecting the revenue and granting rights to the publishing. And so the band entity could act as the publisher. I've seen that plenty of times. But if that is the case, then the band entity is getting revenue in. The band entity then has to divvy up that revenue. So we could say all the members or whoever writes a song owns their publishing of that song, but they grant the LLC the rights to go administer the publishing rights, the publishing of that song. And then the LLC collects the money and divvies it up to the individual members, or the LLC collects the money and keeps it for the LLC. Again, a lot of different possibilities here. Not trying to make your head spin, just trying to give examples of all the different ways we can do things. So we want to write down the way that we are going to do things. The other thing about use and ownership of these copyrights, these publishing rights, is we may need to guarantee the use of some licenses. So we talked about mechanical licenses in past weeks. The mechanical licenses the right to reproduce a composition in a sound recording. Well, if you think about it, I'm in a band, I write the song. Okay, I own all the publishing. Well, the band is going to go record the song, and maybe we give it to a distributor or a label to release that song. Well, I have to grant a mechanical license to the band or the distributor or the label to go and do that. So thinking about, does our operating agreement, does our band agreement need to say the writers, the owners of the publishing, grant a mechanical license to the label or the distributor or the band to go distribute the sound recordings? Similarly, if we're going to make some videos to promote our songs, whoever owns the publishing rights needs to grant a sync license to synchronize the movie with the moving image in a video. We talked about sync licenses week 2, week 4, I don't remember. I think it was week 2. So why are we thinking about sync licenses as well? So it again is just all these different pieces of the puzzle. If we put them all in one agreement, it's going to make our lives a lot easier. So we talk about the publishing rights. That's one side. That's one set of copyrights. The sound recordings, or we call them masters, is the other copyright. Again, copyright is an asset. How are we going to use this asset? Who's going to own it? Who gets to use it? So let's be clear about who owns the masters. Now, frequently in the industry, there's, I won't say a default, but there has been a structure in the past where whoever pays for the creation of the master is the owner of the master. We talked about record deals. I would imagine that probably came up. I'm sorry I missed that week, but the idea, one of the reasons record companies would argue they should own the master is if the record company is paying for the creation of the master, paying for the studio time and the producer and the mixing and mastering, then the record company wants to own the master. Well, here, a lot of times, especially with independent bands, a lot of times the band fund, right, the LLC bank account, is paying to create the master. So does the LLC own the master? That's fine. That makes it almost easier a lot of the time. If the LLC owns the masters, the LLC can sign contracts and license those masters and make life kind of smoother, quicker, easier. But sometimes the individual band members want to retain ownership of the masters. Let's be clear about that so we know down the road how that works, because hopefully these masters are going to make tons of money. And we want to know, how is that money divvied up? Where does it go to? And that's a big part of running a band, being a performing musician. Similarly, talking about ownership is how it's controlled, how it's used, how we decide how these masters are used, and how is that revenue collected and dispersed. And similarly, as I talked about a moment ago, with publishing, do we need to build in any licenses like a sync license for videos? So usually that is something we want to do, make sure whoever owns the master grants the band, like the LLC, the right to make a video, or maybe that right has been granted to a label. It's just going to vary. But we're thinking ahead about all these possibilities, all these things that hopefully come with success. Things like making videos with record labels, if that's your thing. So one of the things that kind of, I think, weaves its way through all this whole conversation is about finances, about money, the band funds. So we often call the band fund the bank account. And as I said, the LLC should have its own bank account, keep all that LLC money separate. But when we form that bank account, who are the signers on this account? It's generally going to be in the name of the LLC under the EIN for the LLC, so that no one individual has control over all the money, usually for the band, and we have an LLC. But what money goes into that account? So does gig money go into that account? Does money from selling albums go into that account, or downloads or whatever? Does merch money go into that account? And also, what comes out of that account? Does gas money for the van go into that account, but also does guitar strings or drum heads come out of that account? And so we want to think about who's paying for what. Where does the money go? Where does the money come from? And where does it go to? And it's going to vary for every band differently, right? But we want to lay it out so we know for sure, so there aren't arguments about it later. So I think that I realize I'm asking a lot of questions in this section of our talk tonight, but that is because every situation is different, and you're going to do what's right for you, for your business, for your group, for your entity, for your venture. And these are just questions we want to make sure that we answer when forming that entity, when creating that structure. So talking about what money goes into the account, also who gets paid what, right? Because I know a lot of bands will say, well, everybody gets $100 a gig or whatever it is. There's a certain amount of gig pay that everybody gets. But some bands will say, if it's a 4-person band, we divide the gig money 5 ways, 20% goes to each member and 20% goes into the LLC. Or again, there's all these different ways to do it. Let's lay out how we plan on doing it or how we are doing it. And also, where does the money from the music we sell go to? Where does the money from merch go to? What money paid to create the merch? I've certainly seen situations where one band member is paying, fronting the money to create the merch. That member gets paid back for the cost of goods. There's a lot of different ways this can happen. And by the way, it's okay if it changes later. An operating agreement is not set in stone. We don't want to change it every week, but it can be changed. And that's one of the things we put in the operating agreement is how do we decide to change the operating agreement? Usually it's a vote of the members. Maybe it's a majority vote, maybe it's a 60% vote, whatever that is, that's all part of this structure. So all these things that I'm talking about that go into this band operating agreement can be changed as the band grows. It's just something that we want to get set down because it's not going to change all the time. And we want to be prepared. We want to know how are all these things going to be handled. So one of the other kind of thing that is all connected here is the merchandise. Right? We know there's definitely for a lot of bands and a lot of performing artists, merchandise is an important revenue stream, especially at live performances. So if we are a band and we need to show the images, the faces, and photographs of band members, we would need the rights to do that. If we're using band members' names in promo and publicity and albums and all these other things, we need those rights as well. And I'm certain that everybody says, well, obviously, I'm in the band LLC or the band entity can use my name. We still want to have that in writing. That should be clear. Because I don't know, maybe if your face is on the t-shirt, you get an extra $1. I don't know. There's all sorts of possibilities. And so thinking about our different revenue streams, how those revenue streams are generated and what rights we need for those revenue streams are all things that go into a band agreement. As I mentioned, what money is used to purchase the merch, where does the merch revenue go? And are different revenue streams treated differently? I mean, selling physical music, CDs or vinyls or things like that is often considered merch, hard goods. And so that maybe there's sometimes a different rate for that, especially if we're working with a distributor or a label, because maybe the label printed the vinyl and we have to buy the vinyl from the label at a certain rate. There's all those considerations. Just be thinking about the money in, money out, essentially. And that covers merchandise. So the last thing to talk about from band agreement perspective is the hardest thing to talk about, which is what if there is a leaving member? This is never a fun thing to think about, especially because usually when we're starting a band or writing a band agreement, everything's great. We're planning great things. We're doing this because we're going to be really successful. So nobody wants to think about what happens if somebody leaves the band. Generally, most bands, somebody leaves at some point. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm just saying statistically, usually somebody leaves the band at some point. So we want to be prepared for that because it can be the most divisive event for a band, or certainly one of them. And so if we prepare in advance, if we have it in our band agreement, this is what happens with a leaving member, it can save a lot of time and money if we have to fight about it. There's a lot of lawyers who've made a lot of money fighting about leaving members. And actually, when I first started practicing law, I realized I was doing a lot more band separations than band formations, and that was definitely not the place I wanted to be. And I really started pushing all this stuff about let's get it in writing to all the groups that I was working with, so that when the inevitable leaving member situation happens, we know how it goes and we know what's supposed to happen. So the other thing I'll mention when, for lack of a better term, negotiating a leaving member provision, like the part of the agreement about what happens if a member leaves. If you are in that negotiation, if you're part of a band talking about what happens if a member leaves, think about it from both sides. Most of us in that situation think of it from the side of, I'm not the leaving member. Most of us think, I love this band, I want to do this, I'm never going to be the guy who's leaving or the girl who's leaving. You never know. Life happens. So think about it from both sides, because I see a lot of bands come at this and make it very unfair to the leaving member. And then when they're in the seat of being the leaving member, they're very unhappy about it. So the things we want to think about in a leaving member scenario is basically what the leaving, well, how do we choose, how does someone become a leaving member? Usually it's because someone's choosing to leave, but also what does the member get? Do they get rights to the masters or future revenue from the masters? Do they get rights to their publishing, future revenue from the publishing? Do they get rights to use the name? Maybe just to say formerly a member of this band. And any other revenue streams that are ongoing, like merch or gig money or anything else, because I think a lot of people think, well, you're no longer in the band, you're no longer getting paid. But from the leaving member's perspective, it is, I made this, helped make this band what it is. I've been out on the road, busting my hump for years and years, building up the name of this band. And just because I'm not in the band anymore doesn't mean I shouldn't get paid. That is a very common argument, right? And so thinking ahead about what, if anything, does the leaving member get? I have bands who say, you leave, you get nothing. Okay, as long as everybody agrees and we put it in writing, totally fine that we can do it that way. But the important distinction is the difference between a voluntarily leaving member and an expelled member. Now, not every band allows for expulsion. Expulsion being voting someone out of the band. And some bands allow for that, some bands don't. They say no one's getting kicked out unless you want to leave. But if we have a function, we have a mechanism where someone can be kicked out of the band, do they get treated differently? Do they get paid something different if they voluntarily leave versus they get kicked out of the band? And so all of these things are not fun conversations, not a fun conversation to have, but all really important. And by the way, this also applies to any LLC. Right? Any LLC could have a leaving member. Now, the way we write an operating agreement for a band versus the way we write an operating agreement for a more typical business LLC, marketing company or something, is going to be different because the ownership interests, those membership interests, are less transferable for a band. Usually the bass player is leaving, he's not just going to give his ownership in the band to another bass player. Not usually how it works. So we have to think about it. And it is a little technical. It is a little complicated, but it is definitely something we want to make sure to address. The flip side of this is, what if we have a new member? And how do we add a new member? Generally, it's going to be a vote of the members. How does that work? By what threshold? What do they get? Do they build up to their percentage ownership? Do they get rights or money from the old tracks that they didn't perform on? Those sorts of things are all considerations. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it can get complicated. So we want to be thinking about all of those things. So I'll leave it there. Not necessarily fun, really important. Happy to answer questions about it. And the last thing I'll say about band agreements is something I mentioned at the beginning, which is that a band is not always a democracy. Not always, first of all, it's not always a majority vote, but also not always everybody in the band is in the LLC or the entity, and that's okay. Again, we can be flexible about these things. But we want to make sure we're clear and we still have contracts with everybody involved. If a band has independent contractors or hired guns in the group, great. And it may be there's one member who owns the LLC and everybody else is hired guns. Maybe there's 4 members who own the LLC, but the 3 horn players are hired guns. Again, a million different ways it can happen. But we still want to have agreements with those hired guns, of what we basically would call a band member agreement. So you're a member of the band, but you're not an owner of the LLC. You're not an owner of the company or a member of the company. Those band member agreements are generally much more simple because we're not, a lot of these decision-making functions aren't included because they're not members of the band. They don't get to make those decisions, but we still have to be careful because what if they play on, if a independent contractor performs on a recording, we talked about a few weeks ago, everyone who contributes to the creation of a copyright is a co-owner of that copyright. So if a band member is not supposed to be an owner of a master that they performed on, we need to have that in writing. Okay? And so we want to make sure it's clear about songwriting and master recordings. We also want to be clear about what these independent contractors get paid, what, when, and why. Right? Are they getting paid gig money? Are they getting paid from the masters? Are they getting paid from merch? Generally, they're usually getting paid for gigs. But what about rehearsals? They get paid for rehearsal time. All those sorts of things and their obligations. How many rehearsals do they have to show up to? Are they obligated to play on every gig? Do they have to find a sub if they can't? All those sorts of things. Again, we may have an oral agreement about it. Really good to get it in writing. And also, if we do need that person's name and likeness for album covers, t-shirts, whatever, make sure that's in there as well. So side agreement there with the band member agreements, but that covers a lot, just about everything when it comes to band agreements and entities. I will take a sip of my water and see if anyone has any questions they want to pop in the chat. Well, either everybody is stunned into silence or I'm covering it so well that no one could possibly have any questions. Or you can just save your questions till the end. That's totally fine too, but feel free to pop them in the chat as they come up. So the kind of third part of our presentation today is trademarks. We're switching gears here. Trademarks and entities, both part of running a band as a business, but very, very different things. So I will do my best here to cover trademarks. Trademarks is an entire semester-long class in law school. I'm going to try and do it in 25 minutes. And I'm feeling good. So, and trademarks, by the way, the reason we're talking about trademarks today is because it is part of your business. It is a business asset, but also it is really the name of the band is the most common trademark. And that is something I talked about a few minutes ago, an asset that we talk about in the band agreement. We can also, but a trademark covers any brand name, any name of a product, also logos and taglines. It's basically how we identify the product or service we're engaging with. So the law says it's any word, name, symbol, or device that identifies the source of a product or service. What does that mean? It means when you are buying something or engaging with a business, you're recognizing the name or the logo. So here are examples of trademarks. These are not band names. I could have done a whole slide of different band names, but I think you probably know what they are. There are some band logos for sure. Being the old guy, I'll use Led Zeppelin as the example. Many of you may know there's the Led Zeppelin symbols that were on albums very, very long time ago, but Prince had the symbol of his name when he was just a symbol, formerly known as Prince. So trademarks can be, or rather, logos are trademarks, and we do have sometimes logos for bands, but usually, generally, the band name or the performing artist name, even if you are not in a band, even if you're a solo artist, even if you're a producer, you have a name, because a pseudonym, a stage name, is a trademark, right? And so there's a lot of value here for a lot of people, most performing artists in the music industry. Trademarks can be of three different types, basically. The word mark is, and again, easier to use a product we're all familiar with Nike. So in Nike's situation, the word Nike is what we call the word mark. One type of the most common type of trademark is a word mark. But a logo, like the Nike swoosh, is also a trademark. So like I said, the Prince insignia is also a trademark. And even a tagline, not very common for bands or for performing artists, is also a trademark. So you all have trademarks. If you are putting yourself out in the world, marketing yourself as an artist or in your other lines of work, you have a trademark. And whether it is your given name, a band name, a pseudonym, or stage name, these are all trademarks. So trademarks are trademark rights. Oh, and by the way, trademarks are intellectual property. We talk about IP, we talk about copyrights are intellectual property. Trademarks are also intellectual property, which means it is something that you own, you just can't touch, but it's something that we can buy and sell and make money off of. So trademarks are based on use, or trademark rights are based on use. And what I mean by that is you have a trademark as soon as you start using it. The name of my law firm is Creative Law Network. As soon as I hung my shingle, opened my law firm, and started putting up a website that says Creative Law Network, I have a trademark. And so we get these common law rights just by using the trademark. So if you are a band or you are a performing artist and you are releasing music or you are playing gigs, you have a trademark with the name that you are performing under or releasing music under. And these common law rights are somewhat limited in trademark world anyway, because they're limited just to the goods or services you're using it with and the geographic area that it's used. So if you're only playing gigs and selling music in Colorado, your common law rights are limited to Colorado. Rights to trademarks are related to the goods and services that you're using them with. So we can have similar trademarks for different goods and services owned by different people, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. The user of a trademark is the owner of that trademark by default. But the issue is we can't have that trademark being similar to or infringing on another person's trademark. So we want to make sure we are clear owners of our trademarks. And the idea of there not being a similar or infringing trademark is intuitive, but I will definitely take the moment to explain it, which is just basically that we don't want two trademarks to be similar to each other for a similar product or service, right? There already is a Nike out there. I can't go and form an athletic wear company and call it Nike. That would cause confusion. That would be an infringement. And we don't want two trademarks to be similar to each other for a similar product or service. This is why if you are coming up with a band name, you're trying to come up with a name that is not one that's already out there, right? It's kind of intuitive, right? If you're naming a band, you're going to go and do a Google search. Does any other band use this name? Now, if a plumbing company uses that name, not a problem. We're not causing a likelihood of confusion, right? It's not like people are going to see the band name and think it's the plumbing company. But if there's two bands with the same name or a similar name, that is a problem, because I'm going to go onto Spotify, I'm going to type in the band name I want to listen to, but the other band is going to come up, or we're going to get two different sets of music under the same name, and I'm not going to know which is which. I'm going to cause confusion. So we don't want two trademarks to be similar to each other for a similar product or service. And that's just kind of a baseline tenet of trademark. So if we're using a trademark, how do we prove that we own that trademark? We have a federal trademark registration system. So I'm going to talk about the next little bit here in the context of federal registration. Not that you need to have a registration to own a trademark. As I said, you own a trademark as soon as you start using it. But we get a federal registration because it's the best proof of ownership and makes it easy to enforce our trademarks. So we do federal registration through the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. We call it PTO. It's a federal trademark office. Each country has their own trademark office. So I'm only talking about U.S. here. You can register a trademark in multiple countries, and I've certainly done that for bands that are playing all over the world. But for the purposes of today's conversation, we're just talking about U.S. registration, U.S. trademark rights. And doing a registration through the PTO, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, is complicated. And so it is, I want to talk about the different facets of the registration because I think that helps explain how and why trademarks work. So the value of a registration is that it gives you nationwide priority rights. Like I said, common law rights are limited to the geographic area where you're using that trademark. If you have a federal registration, you get nationwide rights. And all the qualification for that is that you're using the trademark in multiple states, or what we call interstate commerce. And if people in multiple states are downloading or streaming your music, you are arguably using your trademark in multiple states. But the value of a trademark registration goes further than that because it does give us status for pursuing infringers. So if you register the trademark for your band name or your pseudonym, your stage name, and then someone else pops up using the same name for music, for a similar service, similar product, having this registration makes it much, much easier to enforce our rights, especially when it comes to online enforcement, right? So if there is, if you have to go to Spotify, or someone pops up a Facebook page using your same name, your trademark, and they're another band using your band's name, if you go to Facebook and you say, hey, that's mine, take it down, Facebook's going to say, show me your trademark registration. Because they don't know, how do they know who was first and who has the rights? But if the federal government, if the Federal Patent and Trademark Office issues a trademark registration, then they know, okay, we can, we can enforce these rights. So there is value to that. Trademark registration also isn't quick. It takes a long time. It's not very cheap. It does cost some money. So I don't encourage everyone to go register a trademark for every name they come up with, but it does have a lot of value, basically. So the main issue, as I said a moment ago, with trademark is avoiding a likelihood of confusion. We don't want anything that is similar in appearance, pronunciation, or meaning. So it's not just whether something looks the same. A lot of people say, oh, well, I came up with this name for my band and I Googled it and I didn't find anybody else, so I'm good. But did you Google all those different permutations, the different spellings? Because the same word can be spelled a number of different ways and still sound the same. That causes a likelihood of confusion. Or you say, oh, well, I'm using another language for my trademark. Well, if it has the same meaning in a different language, that can cause a likelihood of confusion. And the PTO looks at this very, very broadly, not only how similar the trademarks are, but also how similar are these products or services. So you may say, well, I'm a band. I know there's a film production company with the same name, but music and film are entirely different. The trademark office sees entertainment as all the same. So it's going to be hard to get a federal trademark registration for a name that is used elsewhere in the entertainment industry, even if it's not a band. A lot of things you don't want to think about, but in the situation where you're choosing a band name or choosing a pseudonym, these are all things that are really important. There are tricks people try and use to avoid a likelihood of confusion, but a likelihood of confusion is not avoided by a different spelling if the trademarks sound the same. It's not avoided by adding the or an or because again, the likelihood of confusion is there for the average consumer. The average person who sees two trademarks that are similar to each other is going to be confused, and we consider that infringement. So using a different font, excluding the vowels, does not avoid confusion. You really need something that is distinct and distinguishable from other trademarks that are similar for a similar product or service. So what this leads to is specifying our goods and services. So the way the Trademark Office does this, and again, it's helpful just in thinking about how we are going to use our trademarks, whether it's our band name or any other, a pseudonym or any other product or service. When we register trademarks, they're registered in connection with the specific good or service we're offering. And this helps us distinguish one trademark from the other. As I said, the trademark using the same name for a band and a plumbing company is not a problem because they are distinguishable. They are different goods and services. And that is useful in choosing names and registering names and coming up with trademarks and using trademarks. So when we register a trademark, there's an entire classification system that the Trademark Office uses for registering trademarks. And there are these classes, they're numbered. Okay, there's classes 1 through 47. I don't expect you to know all of them, but I have to deal with them a lot. The three main classes we use in the music industry are classes 9, 25, and 41. So basically, class 9 is entertainment products, class 25 is apparel, shirts, hats, hoodies, things like that, and class 41 is entertainment services. What this means is, if you are going to go do a trademark registration, you're going to register it in one or more of these classes. Now, I will tell you, the Trademark Office charges a filing fee per class because the broader protection we get, the more it costs. One of the annoying, for lack of a better term, things about the classification system is we've had this classification system for decades, long before we had the internet and everything that came along with it. So in the music business, entertainment products are in one class, but entertainment services are in a different class. In the old days, it made sense, okay, well, a product, a CD, a DVD, a vinyl is an entertainment product, where a performance is an entertainment service. Playing a show is an entertainment service. Those are distinguishable. When the internet came along, the powers that be decided that streaming is an entertainment service. So when you go record, you make a recording, and you go distribute vinyl, that vinyl is in class 9. It's an entertainment product. When you take that same recording and you go stream it on Spotify or any of the DSPs, that is an entertainment service in class 41. Sorry, that's just how it goes. So I mentioned that just in the sense of if you do get into this whole trademark process, these are things we'll need to go over or talk about with your attorney, whoever is helping you with your trademark. But it also just helps for conceiving of how we distinguish trademarks from each other and why how we avoid a likelihood of confusion or an infringement. So you may say to me, Dave, I need to come up with a band name. How do I come up with a good band name that I can get a registration for? And the simple part is you want it to be different than other band names. You want it to be distinguishable from other trademarks for a similar good or service. Avoiding common words and phrases is a good way to avoid a likelihood of confusion because there's millions of trademark registrations. So a lot of the words that are common in our language have already been trademarked, have already been registered. So the more creative a trademark is, the easier it generally is to protect it. We call very creative trademarks, we call these fanciful marks, or made up words we call fanciful marks. And the best trademarks out there are made up words. And we're seeing this a lot with a lot of performing artist names, where it's a bizarre combination of consonants or it is a word that we haven't seen before. And these are good trademarks, whether that's why the artist is using that name or not. I have some examples here, not from the music industry, but just from common language or common commerce, I should say. Names like Kodak, Xerox, Exxon, Pepsi. These are all made up words. They're all fanciful trademarks, which makes for good trademarks. So something to think about if you're in the position of naming your next band or coming up with your band name. Valuable kind of advice or something good to follow. I will cover a few more things on registration, then try and finish up and see if we have any questions. One thing, we'll talk about doing a search before you do an application for a trademark registration, the use function of trademark registration, and the dates of first use and what we call specimens. So generally, as I've been talking about, we want to avoid having a similar trademark for a similar product or service. The way we do that is conducting a comprehensive search. It is way more in depth than just Google searching, basically. The Trademark Office database is open to anyone. Anyone can go online to do it. We generally do use special software with unique algorithms or custom algorithms to do these searches. So it's not just typing in the name, because we have to come up with all the different spellings, all the different permutations. But that's what we're generally doing, is we're doing these really comprehensive searches to see what else is out there. And again, for US registration, it's only a trademark being used or registered in the US. The US Trademark Office is primarily concerned with trademarks that are registered or applied for, and with US trademarks, or trademarks that have been registered or applied for in the US. So to think about when you are considering, it's just part of the trademark registration process, is doing these comprehensive searches. So we know what we're up against, because right now the Trademark Office is taking 8 or 9 months to review an application. So instead of waiting 8 or 9 months to find out, oh, there's another trademark out there and we're going to get refused, we do this comprehensive search before we submit the application. So it's basically insurance on the application. We know before we submit the application, oh, there's this other band with the similar sounding name, and therefore we probably shouldn't waste the money on application. So there's a lot of value to that. I said at the beginning of this section that trademark rights are based on use. So to get a registration, the trademark has to be in use, but there is what's called an intent to use application. An intent to use application allows us to submit a registration application before we're actually using the trademark. So we say, I'm intending to use this trademark. I'm reserving the rights to use it because I'm planning on releasing an album or whatever it is. It is the same examination process as an in-use trademark. And then if the Trademark Office approves an intent to use application, we then have up to 3 years, to put it into use and show the trademark office that we are using it. They'll give us the registration. When we do that, we have to provide what are called dates of first use, which is basically the date of first use anywhere and the date of first use in commerce. Those can be the same date, but we have to know the exact day, month, and year. So think about the first show that your band played, or the first show you played under your band name or your stage name, or maybe the first day you released the track. If you released a track before playing a gig, these would be your dates of first use. So we need to know the exact day, month, and year, but we don't have to show proof of that date, month, and year. We don't need proof with a date on it. The proof we use is what's called a specimen. A specimen is basically generally an image showing, maybe it's a concert poster, maybe it is the Spotify page showing you can listen to the track, but we do have to show them the trademark office, this specimen, this proof of use. And the PTO is very, very particular about what they will accept as a specimen. So I'd say the most common reason I see trademarks refused is because of a likelihood of confusion. The second most common is probably because the specimen was inadequate. So if you do submit an unacceptable specimen, you'll get a refusal, but once there's a refusal issued, you will have an opportunity to respond and argue against the refusal. So you get kind of multiple bites at the apple in that sense. Obviously, this is all pretty complicated when it comes to trademarks. Do you need an attorney to do a trademark registration? No, you do not. A lot of people go and do these applications themselves. Anyone can sign up on the PTO website and submit a trademark application. But when you go to the PTO website, you will notice that they strongly encourage you to hire a trademark attorney because they know how frequently these registrations are refused when they're not, or sorry, the applications are refused when they're not prepared by an attorney that has the trademark knowledge and experience. So not an advertisement for attorneys. Again, you can go to CAFTA, go to Colorado Attorneys for the Arts and find a pro bono attorney to help you with your trademark registration if you qualify. But at least something to keep in mind if you are planning on pursuing trademark protection. So, man, I've been talking a long time. Let's talk about what we went through so far. Basically, or what we've talked about tonight, basically a band is a business, and reason we form an entity or consider forming an entity for a band is, or any venture in the music industry, is an entity is a separate person, and that separate entity has its own liability. We create that liability shield between the entity and the individual, and that is really helpful for a lot of things in the music business. We generally, when we form an entity, in Colorado anyway, most of my clients are using LLCs because they're very flexible entities, lighter and easier to maintain. But every band, regardless of whether you have an LLC or not, should have a band agreement. If you do form an LLC, in my experience, using the operating agreement as the band agreement is a very valuable function, makes things a little bit easier. And don't forget to cover leaving member provisions if you have a multiple member band or multiple members in an LLC, because that can be the hardest part and the most frequent thing we have to go back and look at and deal with down the road. Also try and use band member agreements with people in the band who are not in the LLC or not full-time members of the band. And then very generally, when it comes to trademarks, think about trademarks, protect your trademarks. And that's what I prepared. So please pop a question in the chat because I've got to believe I left something out or someone has a question about something. I mean, stunned silence, I guess. So I guess, Meredith, I can hand it back to you. Thanks, Chip. I know it is a lot of information.
It's so much good information, Dave, and I think you did a great job of giving people sort of the questions to ask and the ways to help them navigate. As you said, every situation is going to be different, and that's why we have wonderful lawyers like you and Max, who joined us for the other half, and other folks who've even been on this call with us, as well as Colorado Attorneys for the Arts. So don't do it alone. Don't write that agreement on your own. Don't register your trademark on your own. We are here to help you. And this was I'm sorry, I'm giggling at the wonderful praise that's in the chat. Warming my heart. This has been such a terrific series. Thank you all for being part of it. We hope these resources continue to be helpful. And Colorado Attorneys for the Arts and the Colorado Music Industry Alliance are here for you. So with that, I think we'll wrap up tonight's session and the series. How long will I see a question. They will stay on CBCA's YouTube page indefinitely. I don't know why we would take them down, but they'll be there for a while.
As long as YouTube allows us to have them up there, they will be on YouTube.
Yeah. And we will also link them on CBCA's website. We'll have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thank you again, Dave. Thank you to Max for the other evenings. And we'll see you later.
Thanks.